Hi, everyone. We're going to do something similar to our famous quotes on Paul. We're going to do a series of books, famous critical books on Paul. So this is the first one we're going to start with is probably the most unknown among American Christians, English-speaking Christians. It's a book by Nicholas Antoine Boulanger. Boulanger, I'm sure, is how most people would say it. So we'll see how I pronounce it. I'll sometimes pronounce it the French way. Anyway, you would see if you look there in the middle of the page, this is the title of the book, An English Critical Examination on the Life of St. Paul, translated from the French of Boulanger, London, 1823. This book was written in 1746, and so it was only translated, 80 years later, apparently, approximately, into English. So that's how long it's been in our English language. And here's his biography at Geographics, Rare Antique Maps. And you're going to look at the dates there of his date of death. He was born in 1722, dies in 1759. So that means he's 37 years old when he dies. This painting looks like a man who's seemingly older than that. So I always wondered about this, but it says so likewise in Wikipedia. So maybe he was 37 years old, and like some, he was prematurely gray. But anyway, the achievements he made in 37 years of his life are pretty amazing. Here is a small biography in Geographicus. Nicholas Antoine Boulanger, November 1722 to September 1759, sometimes spelled Boulanger, was a French mapmaker, scientist, mathematician, and philosopher active in Paris during the middle part of the 18th century. Boulanger was the son of a Paris paper merchant. He studied mathematics and became an engineer before turning to the study of Oriental languages and philosophy. Boulanger is responsible for several works, including an influential work on geology entitled Les Anecdotes de la Nature. Much of his work is controversial and included criticisms of the Catholic Church, St. Paul, and Christianity in general, and consequently was either never published or published posthumously. There is one posthumous book that we cannot ascribe to him because somebody used his name after Boulanger died and wrote a book under Boulanger's name, even though Boulanger did not write it. And this is German-born Baron de Holbach. He died in 1789, published the controversial anti-religious work Christianity Unveiled, and that was in 1761. So Boulanger had been dead 2 years, right? 1759. This is 2 years later. Holbach decides to write a book in Boulanger's name, and so he using Boulanger's name as his pseudonym just 2 years after the philosopher's death. So, and then it says here, Boulanger also was one of the first modern critics of Paul. So we can basically maybe even claim this is the earliest modern criticism of Paul, and it was a very good one. It's not unbalanced or anything. It's just effective analysis of different passages. So I'm going to try to make each of these parts about 15 minutes, and I'll then cut it off, and then we'll pick up a part two, and so you can watch this in small doses. Okay, my introduction. In 1746, Nicholas Antoine Boulanger, 1759 he died, of France, wrote an able criticism of Paul. It was translated and republished in 1823 in English. Boulanger focused entirely upon Paul's validity and found him wanting. And this is just an introductory quote I found that intrigued me about the book to begin with. Quote, "We should never finish were we to relate all the contradictions which are to be found in the writings attributed to St. Paul. Generally speaking, it is St. Paul that ought to be regarded as the true founder of Christian theology, which from its foundation has been incessantly agitated by quarrels and divisions. Boulanger and Peter Annette, Critical Examination of the Life of St. Paul, Letter to Gilbert West, 1746, and we'll then begin. The tenor of the book. So this is me writing. The opening letter to a defender of Paul gives us some tenor of the book that the truth about Paul has been veiled from our eyes by long conditioning. So he's writing to somebody who's a defender of Paul. And this is what he says. This is what Boulanger says to this person. Sir, in our last conversation, you appeared to me very much smitten with St. Paul and his works. You recommended me to reperuse his writings, assuring me that I should there find arguments well calculated to shake incredulity and confirm a Christian in his faith. Although the actions of this celebrated apostle, related in the Acts, and his doctrine contained in his epistles were already perfectly known to me, yet to conform myself to your desires and give you proofs of my docility, I have again read those works, and I can assure you that I have done it with the greatest attention. You will judge of that yourself by the reflections I send you. They will at least prove to you that I have read with attention. A superficial glance is only likely to deceive us or leave us in error. The passions and the prejudices of men prevent them from examining with candor, and from their indolence they are often disgusted with the researches necessary for discovering truth. That has also been with so much care veiled from their eyes. But it is in vain to cover it. Its splendor will sooner or later shine forth. The works of enthusiasm or imposture will always end by betraying themselves. As for the rest, read and judge. You will find, I think, at least some reasons for abating a little from that high opinion that prejudice gives us of the apostle of the Gentiles. I'm not ignorant that it is very difficult to undo at one blow the ideas to which the mind has been so long accustomed. But whatever may be your judgment, it will not alter the sentiments of friendship and attachment which are due to the goodness of your heart. I think that's a very, very brilliant opening, and showing that he's paying close attention. He's not This is not a superficial work. He's going to go in depth and analyze it, and he's basically saying easily it works both ways. As we by indolence cannot pay attention to what we're reading and therefore fall into error of accepting something uncritically. All right, so let's read on. I'm going to take a break real quick. Now, this is my heading I made for this. Paul's view alters, destroys Judaism and not merely proclaims fulfillment of promises. And by the way, this is very important. If you accept Paul, you've destroyed the very fabric of the law and the prophets that Jesus affirmed. So you really are being led away from what Jesus was teaching, whether you know it or not, or whether you've thought about it or not. So listen to what he says. Boulanger's text begins. Many theologians would make us regard the miraculous conversion and apostleship of St. Paul as one of the strongest proofs of the truth of Christianity. But in viewing the thing closely, it appears that this conversion, far from proving anything in favor of this religion, invalidates the other proofs of it. St. Paul himself, willing to make use of these oracles of the Jewish nation to prove the mission of Christ, is obliged to distort them and to seek in them a mystical, allegorical, and figurative sense. On the other side, how can these prophecies made by Jews and addressed to Jews serve as proofs of the doctrine of St. Paul, who had evidently formed the design of altering or even destroying the Jewish religion in order to raise a new system on its ruins? Such being the state of things, what real connection or what relation can there be between the religious system of the Jews and that of St. Paul? For this apostle to have had the right of making use of the Jewish prophecies, it would have been necessary that he should have remained a Jew. His conversion to Christianity evidently deprived him of the privilege of serving himself by having recourse to the prophecies belonging to a religion that he had just abandoned and the ruin of which he meditated. True prophecies can only be found in a divine religion, and it's really a religion truly divine can neither be altered, reformed, nor destroyed. God himself, if he is immutable, could not change it. Pages 1 to 2. I'm going to pause right there. Amazing. This is such a valid point, that how can we have been fooled and tricked that somebody could come along and alter and destroy the very thing that is God said is eternal for all generations 16, 20, actually more than 16 times. That's what it reads in the law. that it's an eternal thing. And Jesus says the same thing, until the heavens, eternal for all generations is what the original Testament says. So when generation cease, Jesus said, that's when the heavens and earth are rolled up. And so he says the law and prophets, the law will continue until the heavens and earth pass away. That's what Jesus said twice. So, and that's in Matthew 5. So this is such a valid point. How could it be destroyed by this man? It's something that's immutable, unchangeable for that period of time that God defined. So I digress. Paul's incongruous position on the law. Boulanger continues and shows the incongruity of Paul's attacks on the law and his validity. He begins. In fact, might not the Jews have said to St. Paul, "Apostate that you are, you believe in our prophecies, and you come to destroy the religion founded upon the same prophecies"? If you believe in our oracles, you are forced to believe that the religion which you have acquitted is a true religion and divinely inspired. If you say that God has changed his mind, you are impious in pretending that God could change and was not sufficiently wise to give at once to his people a perfect worship, and one which had no need of being reformed. On the other side, do not the reiterated promises of the Most High, confirmed by paths to our fathers, assure us that his alliance with us should endure eternally? You are then an impostor, and according to our law, we ought to exterminate you, seeing that Moses, our divine legislator, orders us to put to death whoever shall have the temerity to preach to us a new worship, even though he should confirm his mission by prodigies. And I'm going to pause there. He's referring to Deuteronomy 13, 1 to 10. That's the passage on apostates. He's virtually quoting it. So let's continue. The God that you preach is not the God of our fathers. Thus, your new God and your dogmas are contrary to our law, and consequently, we ought to hold them in abhorrence. In short, these same Jews might have said to St. Paul, quote, you deceive yourself in saying that you are the disciple of Jesus. Your Jesus was a Jew. During the whole of his life, he was circumcised. He conformed himself to all the legal ordinances. He often protested that he came to accomplish and not to abolish the law, while you, in contempt of the protestations of the Master, whose apostle you say you are, take the liberty of changing his holy law, of decrying it, of dispensing with its most essential ordinances. At page 2. We're only at page 2, and he's devastated Paul already. And anybody who knows anything about Paul's words and Jesus' words will go, this is actually, how did we not see this? How have we just blocked our brains from hearing it and knowing it? So well put, Mr. Boulanger. The next heading is Paul's imbalances, inconsistencies, and false reasonings. Boulanger makes another introductory criticism at page 5. But what right can we then affirm today that the works of St. Paul, formerly rejected by so many Christian sects, are authentic, that is to say, truly belong to this apostle? On the other hand, how can we attribute to divine inspiration writings filled with inconsistencies, contradictions, mistakes, and false reasonings, in a word, which bear every character of delirium, of ignorance, and of fraud? Next, Boulanger will talk about something that's very important historically. Many Christians are not aware of what he's telling you about. So we document all of this on our YouTube channel and in our website. This is his next. This is my next heading for his next topic. Most of the original church rejected Paul. Boulanger points out that the first disciples were known as Nazarenes and continued to keep the law after Jesus ascended. We know that the name of Nazarenes was the first which was given to the Christians. Actually, it was the Ebion, and then they became the Nazarenes, but that's okay. Saint Epiphanius, from whom the preceding passage is taken, says that they were thus named because of Jesus of Nazareth, of whom they were the first disciples. The Jews called them Nazarenes from the Hebrew word Nazarim, which signifies one separated or excommunicated. Again, they designated them under the name of Minians, that is to say, heretics. They were also by contempt called Ebionites. Okay, so that's the more original name if you study more in depth, which signifies poor, mendicant, weak-minded. Well, that's how some people like to think of it. But Ebion simply meant poor, like the poor that Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit and so on. All right. In fact, the Hebrew Ebion means poor, miserable, and we know that the first followers of Christ were everything but opulent or intelligent men. The first faithful were Jews converted by Jesus himself or by the most ancient apostles, such as Peter, James, and John, who, as well as their master, lived in Judaism. These apostles, disciples, and new converts differed from the Jews in nothing but the belief in Jesus Christ, whom they regarded as the Messiah predicted by the prophets. Otherwise, they believed themselves bound constantly to observe the Mosaic law, persuaded that their Messiah was come to accomplish and not destroy this law. In consequence of this, they observed circumcision, and that is for Jews, let's just be clear, the Jewish people are sons of Israel, and they inherited that inside of the Mosaic covenant from the Abrahamic covenant. But that was not extended to Gentiles. That's clear because of the exceptions. The exceptions under the Mosaic law, where the Gentiles, the Gur, had to be circumcised, were clearly specified. For Passover, if you were Gentile, if you wanted to celebrate Passover in someone's home, you had to be circumcised, or if you wanted to go to the temple, you had to be circumcised. But let's continue. In consequence of this, they observe circumcision, the abstinence from certain meats, separation from the Gentiles, in a word, the Jewish rites and ordinances. Thus, the first apostles and their adherents were only Jews, persuaded that the Messiah was already come and was going soon to commence his reign, which made them hated and persecuted as schismatics or heretics by their fellow citizens. St. Jerome informs us, quote, that even down to his time, the Jews used to anathematize the Christians under the name of Nazarenes 3 times a day in their synagogues. So basically, the early Christians were anathematized or cursed by those who were Jews because of their view of Jesus Christ. Okay. Yet, and continuing, that's at page 5 to 6. Yet Boulanger points out the Nazarenes had a highly negative view of Paul. The Acts of Apostles adopted by the Ebionites or Nazarenes relate, amongst other things, that, quote, Paul was originally a pagan, that he came to Jerusalem where he dwelt for some time, that being desirous of marrying the daughter of the high priest, he became a proselyte and was circumcised, but not being able to obtain the woman he desired, he quarreled with the Jews, began to write against the circumcision, against observation of the Sabbath, and against legal ordinances at page 5. And as we mentioned, that's in Epiphanius in his book called Panarion. I think it's chapter 30, if I recollect. Let's continue. Boulanger points out the presumed validity of the Ebionites' opinions about Paul. Page 6. All this evidently proves that the Nazarenes or Ebionites were the first Christians taught by the most considerable of the apostles, and that the first Christians were only Reformed Jews. Pause. Yes, the Ebion was the name of the church at Jerusalem, and even Jerome admits that, and he puts that in the book of Galatians commentary he makes. Let's continue. This is clearly the only idea we can form of Christianity such as it was taught by Jesus Christ himself. How then comes it that since Jesus, Christianity has been so separated from Judaism? A slight attention will prove to us that this is owing to St. Paul. Repulsed by the Jews, or perhaps desirous of playing a more important part, we see him separate himself from his brethren of Jerusalem and undertake the conversion of the Gentiles, for whom the Jews entertained no sentiment but horror. Now, I think he's exaggerating that. The Peter in Acts 10, he basically realizes this idea of separating from Gentiles is unnecessary, and this God does not command that. It's actually not in the law. It was a tradition of the Pharisees. And continuing, we go on and undertake but repulsed by the Jews, or perhaps desirous of playing a more important part, we see him, St. Paul, separate himself from his brethren of Jerusalem and undertake the conversion of the Gentiles, for whom the Jews entertain no sentiment but horror. Now, I think maybe he might have meant there for whom Paul was whom they had horror over, not the Jew, than to Gentiles. So maybe it could be read either way. Let's continue. Encouraged by his first successes and wishing to extend them, he dispensed the pagans from the painful ceremony of circumcision. He declared that the law of Moses was only a law of servitude. That's Paul does that, and he does it clearly in Galatians. He calls it bondage. Why do you want to be in bondage again to the weak and beggarly elements, the celestial beings, the angels who gave the law? That's in Galatians 3:19, and then in Galatians 4:8, 9, and 10, if you read on. He declared that the law of Moses was only a law of servitude from which Jesus was come to free mankind. Pause. So, yes, Boulanger is completely correct. Paul was teaching that Jesus didn't come to teach us to follow the law and have freedom from sin by obeying God's word. That's what Jesus says in John chapter 8, if you read it. And no, it's Paul's contrary view to John chapter 8. It's that Jesus came to liberate us from the law, from not having, we don't have to read it, we don't have to obey it anymore. That's what Paul teaches is the purpose of Jesus' message. Continuing, Paul pretended that all the old law was merely the emblem and figure of the new. He announced himself as the apostle of the Gentiles, and leaving Peter and the other Nazarenes to preach the gospel of circumcision. He preached his own gospel, which he himself called the gospel of uncircumcision. In a word, he made a divorce with Jewish laws, to which his apostolic brethren believed they ought to hold themselves attached, at least in most respects. The conduct of Paul must naturally have displeased the seniors in the apostleship, but fear appears to have determined them to cede, at least for a time, to our missionary who had already made a considerable party. Nevertheless, the Acts of Apostles and the writings of Paul prove to us his quarrels with his brethren, who, according to appearances, never viewed with a friendly eye his enterprises and innovations. Moreover, Eusebius and St. Epiphanius inform us that our apostle was regarded as an apostate, an impostor, and an enemy by the Ebionites, that is to say, by the first faithful. And we've documented those quotes from literally Eusebius and Epiphanius. These are Christians of the 300s who were documenting and recording what was well known as a fact that this is what the early church, the Ebionites, has determined about Paul. He was an apostate, an impostor, and an enemy. Anyway, let's continue with the quote. But St. Paul's party having in the end prevailed, the Jewish law was entirely banished from Christianity, and the Ebionites or Nazarenes, though of more ancient date and though formed by Christ and his first apostles, were declared heretics at 6-7. And just so we know, that does not happen until the 300s. They're not declared heretics earlier. Some people think that's what Irenaeus is doing because the title of the book, which was simply opinions, the word heresis simply means opinions or philosophical schools, does not mean you're a heretic. And in there was the Ebionites, but he doesn't say they're evil or their doctrines are wrong. He's just recording what people believe. And so there was no hostility like we see later in the 300s when the church turns towards a deity of Christ, a doctrine of, it's no longer the teachings of Jesus what matter. It's what you think he was and how he came here and what his identity was, whether he was God or not, determined you were saved or not, rather than following him. So it became a religion about Jesus rather than a religion that Jesus had taught us what to do and how to have eternal life. All right, so I'm going to stop it there. We'll pick it up in the next episode. Ciao. Bye.